Good evening, Mr. Rahman. It's a pleasure to have you with us, sir.
Good evening.
We're just waiting for another panelist to join us and hopefully more attendees as well. In about 3 minutes at 7, we'll start.
Oh, okay, no problem. How's everything?
Perfectly fine, sir. I hope you're doing well as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. So you are Dr. Nadim.
And I'm Waleed Yaver. Dr. Nadeem is our executive director.
Okay.
He will hopefully be among the attendees. I
Okay.
believe you've been coordinating with Dr. Nadeem.
Sure.
I'm an assistant research associate, sir, at IPRI.
Okay. Thank you so much. So you'll moderate the session.
Sorry?
You will moderate the session.
I will be moderating the session.
Okay.
And we're hoping for a very good discussion as well.
Hope so.
Is this event, it's expected to end in an hour and a half, is that correct?
It is, Dr. Nadeem, it is.
Okay.
We have 10 minutes per speaker. We have 4 speakers, and then the rest of the time we'll have for the question and answer session.
Okay. I might have to leave promptly at the end time. If it's going on, I can try and stick around, but I might have to leave in case it doesn't end.
No worries, no worries.
Okay.
No worries. By the hour and a half mark, we'll most probably be towards the end, if not have ended it
Okay.
altogether.
Perfect, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good evening and a good morning to our speakers and participants joining us from the United States. On behalf of Islamabad Policy Research Institute, I welcome you all to today's webinar titled Populism and Reconfiguration of State in South Asia. The topic is both timely and pertinent given the various manifestations and forms of populism across the globe, which, as some might say, are as much a challenge to good governance as they are to a more integrated and globalized world order. The challenge, of course, has been intensified given the state of affairs this past year. To speak on governmental populism in South Asia, its emphasis on identity politics and the ensuing polarization that is reflected in foreign and security policies of states in the region, we are delighted to have with us 4 distinguished speakers. It is my honor to introduce them to our audience. Our first speaker is Dr. Farhan Hanif Siddiqui. Dr. Farhan is the director of and assistant professor at the School of Politics and International Relations, Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. He has authored a book titled The Politics of Ethnicity in Pakistan, the Baloch, Sindhi, and Mohajir Ethnic Movements, which was published in Routledge in 2012. Dr. Farhan will be speaking on the topic, the identity politics and manifestations of populism in South Asia. Second up is Dr. Niloufar Siddiqui. Dr. Niloufar is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Albany, State University of New York. She's a PhD in political science from Yale and studies political parties, political violence, and politics of religion and ethnicity. Dr. Niloufar will be speaking on the topic, polarization and its impact on domestic and foreign policy. Our third speaker is Mr. Anu Anwar. He is a fellow at the Asia Center, Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Harvard University, and an associate in research at Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, in addition to being a visiting fellow at the University of Tokyo's Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia. His area of research interests include Chinese foreign policy, US-China strategic competition, and Asian geopolitics. Mr. Anu Anwar will be speaking on the topic, the impact of nationalist tendencies on the regional connectivity in South Asia, particularly BRI and FOIP. Our last speaker for today's webinar is Mr. Zilur Rahman. He is a journalist by profession and has been working as the anchor for the television program called Tritiyo Matra, which translates into the third dimension and is an award-winning program. And I hope Mr. Zilur Rahman have pronounced it correctly. He has produced more than 6,352 episodes concerning politics, governance, and current international affairs over the last 18 years. He worked for the World Bank and UNICEF as a short-term consultant and heads CCN, a media consultancy firm. Mr. Zilur Rahman will be speaking on the topic, the role of identity politics in impacting the security dynamics and strategic stability in South Asia. To commence with the webinar, I will request Acting President IPRI, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, for his welcoming remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Walid. I extend a very warm welcome to all the distinguished panelists and hope that we have a very engaging discussion today on a topic which is of great importance to the region. The topic is focused on South Asia, and one of the variables of the topic is the populism and how it affects the state and societies in South Asia. Now, populism, as we all understand, is a phenomena that is characterized by use of emotions, use of slogans, use of irrational thoughts, which trump rationality, logic, and consensual governance. The world, as we see nowadays, because of varying reasons, is in the grip of this wave of populism. You know, countries like Brazil, where we have Bolsonaro, Philippines, where we have Duterte. We just had seen Trump, United States, and Modi in our neighborhood in India. Now, this populism is characterized with an affiliation with the far right, pandering to the raw emotions at the cost of the essence of democracy, that is the participation of the masses and the participation of the deprived communities into political and economic decision-making of a state. Now, we know in our neighborhood, if you can use India as a case study, we knew that there was a Nehruvian secularism, which was the creed, which was the political creed as well as the ideological creed, which slowly and sedulously has been overtaken by a misanthropic and a xenophobic creed that is Hindutva. And they have their Masalam RSS, which has a very strong organization on ground and which has started acting as the violent face of a political front that is BJP essentially. Now the result is divisiveness, result is otherness, the result is bad relations with all the neighbors and a continual state of conflict, confrontation, competitiveness at the cost of inclusiveness, at the cost of cooperative engagement and peace in the region. We know that India had a secular constitution, but now we see that slowly those symbolisms of secularism are being chipped away. There are examples like revocation of Article 370, annexation of Kashmir, Citizen Amendment Act, National Register of Citizen, all those acts which aim at marginalizing the minorities, their persecution, and doing all that is possible to impose a majoritarian rule over a country which once prided itself on its diversity and inclusiveness. Now, the main question that we as audience would like to be enlightened from learned panelists is that it's okay that this kind of populism has always been there. Nazism in Germany and their exclusive philosophy of eugenics, from where they drew their inspiration, are all part of that irrational construct. But why is it that in this age, this has staged a comeback, this kind of creed? And why is it that a very vast majority of people who have plumbed for this narrative, hook, line, and sinker, is it a yearning on the part of Hindus who had been completely subjugated, and there was a feeling to reclaim their status and to seek some kind of a psychological revenge for something that had lain in their subconscious since centuries of oppression? Or is it a corporate Hindutva nexus, which is allowing the corporate minority to be foisted upon a majority at the cost of inclusiveness, social justice, and equity? We know that those of us who have read Capital and Its Inequity, the book, which says that India is becoming one of the most unequal nations in the world. So the major question is that what is happening in the state and what is happening at the society level? Why is state turning towards populism, and why is society picking up that creed? There must be some demand in the society so as to allow the state to encroach upon that turf which once was diverse, inclusive, consensual, and democratic. So this was my 2 cents on the issue, and I leave the turf open for the learned panelists to enlighten us on the subject. So over to you, Walid, with the first speaker.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now commence with the working session. I would like to remind our participants to please keep sending us their questions in the chat box. Please do so during the course of the webinar and not necessarily towards just the end. I would now request today's first esteemed speaker, Dr. Farhan Hanif Siddiqui, for his presentation on the topic, the identity politics and manifestations of populism in South Asia. And sir, with regards to your presentation, I was hoping if you could delve more into populist rhetoric and actions and how these actions have had an effect on governance in South Asia, and whether inherently you believe that populism is a challenge to good governance. Sir.
Thank you very much, and for the introduction, and thank you also for having me today on a topic which is very seminal, not only in the context of South Asia, but the entire world. And the topic provided for asks me to speak of identity politics and manifestations of populism in South Asia. And what I'll do over the next 10 to 15 minutes is to engage first in a conceptual undertaking, speaking about what I mean by identity politics. And being the first speaker, I'll take this in order also to speak conceptually a bit about populism as well, and how does populism intersect with questions and notions of identity. The second part of my talk will be about the empirical dynamics, and I'll speak of primarily of both the structural and cultural dynamics and variables that feed into what is now a populist identity politics, specifically in Pakistan and India. And what I mean by structural dynamics or variables are the more formal, legal, institutional, constitutional parameters in place. And what I mean by the cultural variables is more the discursive, normative, or the society-centered processes that are play again in both Pakistan and India. To speak about identity politics first, very quickly, I'll broach three main arguments of why identity politics is germane and relevant to the world today. Speaking about first about the argument about how the entire project of modernity and nation building and state building has at its core the idea or the project or the policy of social exclusion. And this is something that Vima argues in his book about how social exclusion is not an all-inclusive, modernity, sorry, is not an all-inclusive process, and social exclusion is very heavily embedded into the processes of how modern states and nations have emerged in the last 300 years. And this is what makes identity politics imperative and important for us, not only in history, but today as well. A second argument about identity politics is how it is relevant in both the developed and developing world. So there was a time in the 50s and the 60s where it was argued that modernization processes will override feelings or self-expressions of ethnic identity and will lead to the creation of more civic identities, as is happening in the developed parts of the world. But then again, you had Walker Corner, for example, in the 60s and the 70s, telling us that economic factors are largely inconsequential to movements for ethnic identity. It's more sociological, it's more psychological. And even in the developed world, you have ethnic identity movements manifesting themselves, for example, in Northern Ireland, or the Basque separatists and Catalonians in Spain, about the Quebec separatists in Canada. And more recently, one could speak about racial violence in the US. But also what is happening today with respect to independence referendums and feelings relative to national self-determination in the Scotland and Catalonian regions, and that is again from the developed parts of the world. A third major idea about identity politics is where it flows from. And again, it flows from both majoritarian and minoritarian context. So again, the conventional argument was more about a minority being suppressed, discriminated, deprived, dispossessed, manifesting itself against the exploitation of the majority. And now we have a majoritarian nationalism, which seeks argument about reverse discrimination, that the minority maybe is more powerful socially, politically, economically, and the majority, so to speak, is being undermined. And this majoritarian nationalism is what provides the link with the larger discussion of populism. And the recent literature, if I come to populism, it understands populism through a two-dimensional space. And again, there is disagreement whether these two spaces coexist together. There are some who separate, some of them who bring together. But the first dimension is about the vertical opposition that populism creates between the public and the masses and the elites. So the people in this understanding are the underdog. They have been denied power, resources, development, education, health by a self-serving corrupt elite. And corruption is the main, so to speak, political program that drives the political imagination and the political mobilization of populist politicians and populist parties. And in this mobilization, this vertical mobilization of the people versus the elites, the important point here is that both the people and the elites belong to the same identity group, so there are no differences there. But populism also creates a horizontal opposition. And this horizontal opposition relates to what are the processes of otherization. So when you have majority groups primarily invoking a very ethnocentric framework of their existence in the nation, in the state, as a political community, as a moral community, and then engaging in formal, legal, constitutional, and other and even discursive issue areas in order to propound this very aggressive majoritarian politics and nationalism into place. And it is also about how political elites at the top, they speak of themselves and other identity groups, because this provides a very strong push factor to groups in society who then carry on the same kind of politics. So my argument, and if I come to the empirical part, so my argument is that the vertical opposition between the people and the elite, it manifests itself more acutely in Pakistan. The horizontal dimension is relatively less salient. Does not mean it's not there, but it is relatively less salient. And in India, the horizontal opposition in terms of social exclusion and the othering processes are more acutely salient. Vertical opposition, of course, also exists. So to speak about Pakistan, and populism and how this vertical and horizontal opposition plays out. So from a structural perspective, especially when you speak about formal constitutional legal mechanisms, so there are two formal dynamics at play, which in the past years have provided also space for political mobilization of religious actors out in the public. This relates to the Second Amendment to the Constitution with respect to the Ahmadis and their designation as non-Muslims, and of course, blasphemy laws which are associated with it. And in 2017, of course, you had protests on the streets in Islamabad when the government was accused of changing laws, which was seen as more conciliatory towards the Ahmadis. And then the elections next year, of course, catapulted this religious party as the fifth largest party in Pakistan in terms of votes received. A related phenomena in terms, and this is not structural as much as it flows from societal, so to speak, processes, and this is the phenomena of forced religious conversions. And this is predominantly in some districts of Sindh and some districts of Punjab. And in the past 4 years, from a structural perspective, you have the Sindh Assembly, for example, pass a law, which was the forced conversion bill in 2016, but then it took it back because of the opposition that came through from, again, the religious parties. Last year, they tried to pass the law. Again, a minority member of the Provincial Assembly put the bill through a vote, but the Treasury benches, surprisingly, a majority of them, they did not support the bill. And in essence, the bill was invoked, and they said we needed more debate in order to put more succinct legislation into place with this forced conversion bill. At the central government level, and I jump again to the structural side of things, we now have a parliamentary committee which is working on forced conversions, which is a good sign. And this is happening since last year. And in the past few months, they've made visits to the Sindh province. They've met people, and they're working now on the recommendations that will now go and feed into a legislation which in most likelihood will come about with respect to forced conversions. So the point that they're making is that you have this problem of forced conversions, but that we need to make a distinction between forced conversions and voluntary conversions. And there is this Institute of Policy Studies report recently which says that we need to make a distinction between forced conversions and what are essentially faith conversions. But the leader of the parliamentary committee said that there's a very thin line, that even voluntary conversions can hide phenomena of coercion and coerciveness, and that legislation has to take these elements into regard. So from the institutional side, there is some pushback in the sense that, again, the elites at the top realize that there are these social problems that need to be attended to. And of course, Pakistan has seen some institutional success in the sense of the Asia Bibi case 2 years ago, when the Supreme Court set her free on account that there was lack of evidence. So the institutional processes in Pakistan with respect to this horizontal opposition that populism creates, they're not as incriminatory. And at one level, they're also designed to ameliorate the plight of minorities, and which again is not the case in India. So from a positive vantage point of how populism pervades Pakistan, in a more structural sense, political elites at the top, they do not engage in a populist identity rhetoric which produces unnecessary fissures in society. I think the problem maybe is more of complacency, the fear that maybe they will lose out on their electoral vote bank, that they lose out on larger public support, and that prevents them from initiating more stringent legislation. And of course, there's a certain failure in the sense that the societal religious political actors, they went on and it's been more of a non-constraining behavior on that part and on the part of the state to prevent, which of course casts at times a negative shadow over Pakistan's international image as well. So I think with respect to Pakistan, I think a more concerted debate on who or what is a Pakistani maybe is needed. So from one point in time, you could speak about Ahmadis as non-Muslims, but then they're Pakistanis, and that makes a very inclusive identity framework, which entitles them to rights, duties as other Pakistani citizens. And I think a more wholesome public debate needs to be generated on the question of how the identity formation in Pakistan works today. And of course, we need to be mindful of the fact that there is always suffering in silence, and there are these silent sufferers who fear expressing their identity, that it might bring them either verbal or physical violence. But then again, the language of the political elites from the top is not incriminatory. And this is where I turn attention to India, where from a discursive practice, from a more structural side of things, the identity or a populist identity rhetoric is now at play. So local elites, whether they're at the local level, whether they're at the state level or the central government level, these elites are seen making a very expressive and a very strong use of a majoritarian nationalism. And most worryingly, this is now manifesting itself in legislation and constitutional politics. And you have academics who are now stating that India has gone down the route of an ethnic democracy, that it is losing out on its secular credentials and democratic features. And what you have now in India is a more institutionalized dominance of the state by an ethnic group, which again is how majoritarian nationalism is framed, and how this now poses a serious threat to the survival and integrity of the majority nation. And as argued in the introduction, the revocation of Article 370, the passage of the Citizenship Act, which allows Buddhists, Hindus, and Christians and Parsis to seek Indian citizenship. Another promise which the BJP made in its manifesto was about passing a uniform civil code, which would abolish personal laws for all faiths in favor of a single law designated by the state. Mob lynching, the popular elitist discourse is now becoming more incriminatory, and what we see now at the level of the social sphere is increasing segregation. And this is what makes India approximate a high degree of an ethnic democracy, and consequently more of a diminished democracy. From the Indian vantage point, if we speak about which road India will take in the future with respect to the populism that it finds itself in, I think we need to factor in structural resilience of the Indian system, whether there are effective checks and balances that provide safeguards for minorities. You speak about the Indian courts. You can speak about civil society actors who can uphold the normative ideal of Indian constitutionalism, Indian secularism, and Indian democracy. So the structural resilience, I think it is absolutely important. It was all on display, for example, in the US, where we see that the president's desire to bend the system in his own favor has met with a very stiff resistance on the part of the system. So for India, I think this is the essential question of whether its democratic institutions have the resilience to check and balance against this rising majoritarianism, or whether it will lead down to the road of countries like Hungary or Poland or even Russia, where leaders at the top find enough space to do whatever they want in terms of their politics, and again, breeding a program and a policy and a rhetoric of a majoritarian and a very strong ethnic nationalism, which segregates society at large. So this is all I have to say for the topic today. Thank you very much. And I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Farhan, for a very comprehensive presentation. And it's interesting you mentioned social exclusion as a phenomena, which is a prevalent phenomena across the region. Dr. Niloufar, if I can bring you in the discussion, the topic that you're speaking on, of course, is polarization and its impact on domestic and foreign policy. And I was hoping if you could expand on how domestic societies have kept up with or have changed under the transition from opposition-based populism to governmental populism, which has indeed fed into majoritarian populism, as Dr. Farhan perhaps mentioned. Dr. Niloufar.
Great, thank you so much. So first, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. I think, like Dr. Farhan, that this is a really great topic, which raises a number of substantive questions, which can be discussed and debated. It has implications for Pakistan, for South Asia, more broadly as well. I've been thinking a lot about these topics in recent months, partly for my own research and partly because it is hard to avoid these topics in the news, and especially if you have even a cursory or passing interest in politics. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that will follow. I was asked to talk about the influence of the politics of ethnicity and religion on domestic and foreign policy. In order for me to address this topic, I wanted to discuss three broad points today. First, I wanted to talk a little generally about not only populism, which is consistent with what Dr. Farhan just spoke about, but also about the polarization that often seems to go hand in hand with populism. In particular, I want to explore why these two phenomena are sometimes linked and how they in turn interact with the prospects of democratic consolidation. Second, I wanted to talk about the ways in which this polarization has an impact on state-society relations domestically, specifically about the ways in which political institutions are both forced to operate in response to a polarized citizenry, but also how they may work to further polarize this population and perpetuate this polarization. And then finally, I will talk about how these domestic cleavages and the various ways in which society is polarized may affect a society's or state's, foreign policy. So I'll be drawing evidence from a number of different countries with focus on South Asian countries, of course. So let me begin. First, what is the effect of populism or populist rhetoric on polarization in society? So as Dr. Farhan explained so nicely, populists portray themselves as political outsiders. And in the process of doing so, they create a narrative of us versus them. And the us in this case purports to be the real or the true voice of the nation. And the them is portrayed as the political elite. Now, insofar as populism challenges an inherently unequal status quo, this is not necessarily problematic in and of itself. And it can, in fact, be both useful and important. The problem arises when populist leaders engage in authoritarian or undemocratic acts by justifying them and framing these actions as being against the elite and in the interest of the people. So populist rhetoric is often focused on highlighting the necessity of these acts. And it is not uncommon for such a rhetoric to be imbued with misinformation, which further perpetuates distrust among segments of society. So it is this process of hardening differences between my in-group, So me, my kin, my biradari, my ethnic group, my fellow partisan, and outgroups, you, your biradari, your ethnic group, etc. This process of hardening these differences is polarization. Polarization works to confirm biases about the outgroup, which often results in anger and fear of the other, and in some cases, even the perpetuation of violence. So to a large extent, we saw this process unfolding in the United States under the Trump administration. And what scholars have found is that the increasing polarization in the US has had marked effects on the average acceptance by Americans of undemocratic acts. And this has real implications for the prospects of democratic erosion. So for example, Yale University scholars Matthew Graham and Milan Svolik found in a recent study that polarized societies, and here they're looking specifically at the United States, that they are willing to trade off democratic principles for partisan interests. So what does this mean? So they find that only a small percentage of people prioritize democratic principles in their electoral decisions. They found, and I quote, "Most voters are partisans first and Democrats only second." So they found that the more strongly one feels towards one's own political party, the more willing they are to let undemocratic behavior slide. Undemocratic behavior includes altering electoral rules to benefit themselves, preventing civil liberties, or upending checks and balances. Now, if this is the case in the United States, which has a long history of democratic rule, it raises important questions about what voters are willing to let slide in countries with comparatively shorter histories of democracy. Now, polarization is likely in a number of scenarios. It's not always or only linked to partisanship or populism, but it does often end up being tied to parties. So coming a bit closer to home, in Bangladesh, we have another example of a country with a highly polarized public. Here, the polarization is thought to be centered around a cleavage or a foundational schism about the nature of the country's identity and competing views of the foundation of this country, whether this is about Islam or whether it is about a national or ethnic identity tied to the use of the Bengali language. So here too, we have seen lines drawn, and many scholars argue that the violence and other undemocratic acts that break out do so along these lines. The good news is that polarization is neither inevitable nor is it impossible to overturn. So for example, again, this is about polarization, not necessarily populism, but we saw very high levels of ethnic polarization in Karachi in the 1990s, in the 2000s, basically up until 2015. So we had ethnic identities very much solidified along partisan lines. This resulted in voters not holding their parties accountable for very high levels of crime, high levels of violence, and other undemocratic acts. So the lines were drawn such that it was almost a given that a Mohajir would vote for the Mohajir party, the MQM, a Sindhi would vote for the PPP, and so on. There are a number of reasons for this, for the situation in Karachi during this time period, but it ultimately came down to the fact that the incentives for violence, and often these were economic incentives, right? Turf wars, extortion, patta, etc., were greater than the cost that the party's core voters were willing to impose on the party. And this is because there was no real exit option for the core voters. Who would they turn to? The 2018 elections, changed this, and it did so by adding in a third party. So it added in a non-ethnic actor in the form of the PTI. So having a new option permitted the core party voters, co-ethnics, to hold their ethnic parties accountable. So while polarization may be sticky in the short term, it is not something that necessarily has to persist in perpetuity. So then finally turning to what ramifications, if any, these issues of polarization broadly and the politics of religion and ethnicity more specifically can have on foreign policy, I think, like the other speakers have indicated, there are some lessons that we can glean from examining India under Modi's prime ministership. So first, what does it even mean for a foreign policy to be populist? IR scholars have argued that populist actors can use foreign policy as yet another site through which they can reproduce this language of othering, so through which they claim to represent the people. So the domestic discourse of polarization, of the us versus them that I just outlined is then reproduced on the international stage. And a line is drawn between domestic audiences and threatening foreign outgroups. So taking India as an example, most people would consider Modi a populist leader. He and the BJP have ushered in an era of the dominance of Hindu nationalist ideology. This has not only had domestic ramifications about the treatment of Muslims within the country, it has also very much played out on the international stage. So India is deliberately and purposefully projected as a Hindu civilization, as a Hindu nation. There is a focus on Modi speaking in Hindi during visits abroad, visiting Hindu temples during foreign trips, gifting Hinduism-inspired tokens to other foreign leaders. The discourse and imagery around the surgical strikes, which India claimed to have conducted in 2016, were also steeped in Hindu visuals. So the BJP had posters around the country which replayed scenes from the Ramayana as indicative of what happened in the surgical strikes. As such, India's foreign policy is imbued with the sense of projecting an image of a dominant Hindu nation. And again, this may in and of itself not necessarily be problematic, right? So Modi speaking Hindi, giving Hindu tokens or gifts, etc. But to do so, in this case, has required the creation of an other. And this other is other religious groups, primarily Muslims, but also Christians and other minorities. And a ramification of this is that it has become difficult to distinguish the India-Pakistan conflict from communal Hindu-Muslim relations. And indeed, this very well may be the goal of the broader project of Hindutva. Another problematic ramification of this is that it can further polarize the populace. So if Pakistan is portrayed as the enemy on social media, national TV, etc., this may not just remain an issue of interstate relations. It can and will become about the rightful place of Muslims within India, right? If there's a conflation between these communal relations and foreign policy. Because what's key to understand is that foreign policy is in fact not usually salient in the minds of Indian or even Pakistani voters. So MIT scholar Vipin Narang and Paul Stanlin from the University of Chicago have done work on this in India, and in survey work that I've done in Pakistan, it is clear that foreign policy is not at the forefront of voters' minds. But if you communalize international relations, this can have real ramifications for intergroup relations within the country, something that we are very much seeing play out in India. So I'll end here, and I look forward to the Q&A and discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Nilofer, for your insight into what is indeed a very damaging phenomena. I'd now request Mr. Anu Anwar for his presentation on the impact of nationalist tendencies on regional connectivity in South Asia, particularly the BRI and FOIP. And sir, there have been multiple examples of nationalist governments over the past decade, in fact, since the turn of the century, working against global normative economic regimes, against economic integration, but with specific reference to South Asia. How do you see such populist movements and governments, such as our neighbors, interfering into economic integration? Sir,
thank you so much for inviting me for these pertinent topics, and I was very much fascinating to hear our previous panelist discussion on these topics, and I have to say that our Professor Farhan and Professor Nilofer have done outstanding work in these topics, and definitely we can talk about the other impact in the regional connectivity. Is video on? Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you and hear you perfectly.
Okay.
Please continue, Dr. Anwar.
Okay. So I will try to toss on the few point on that. What are the implications of this phenomena in the regional connectivity, particularly BRI and FOIP? If we understand in a broader sense, first we have to acknowledge that the essence of regional connectivity, which is, you can mention, for example, BRI and FOIP, and the essence of is everything fine?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. We can hear you, Mr. Anumra. Please continue.
Okay. It's I would say that these two kind of phenomena is a bit contradictory to some extent. And to understand is a broader sense, we have to look at a little bit on the background part of the what regional connectivity, for example, BRI, how this concept emerged, and how that contradict with the populism and so-called nationalistic tendency in South Asia and elsewhere. So when the basically BRI started in 2013, if you go even back, the Chinese foreign policy started to going out, and if you look at the Chinese the BRI official document, Vision and Action Plan, it basically says that is a Chinese version of globalization and going out to address quite a few key components. One of them in that time, if you look at the time, there is the division between North and South. Pole was quite high. The North Pole is considered as the developed part, and South Pole is the underdeveloped and poverty driven. And also is the Chinese version of to address the protectionism, nationalism. This sort of tendency was the essence of the BRI policy document. And also one of the things that I think the widely misunderstood about Belt and Road Initiative is that the people usually tend to think that the Belt and Road Initiative is basically it's all about building infrastructure and big mega projects. However, if you look at the BRI official document, you will see that the building infrastructure or connectivity is the one of the 5 key policy priorities there, and which is mentioned is a number 2. But the other, such as free trade, financial cooperation, or people-to-people connectivity, these are equally important too. And recently, we have seen that the even Financial Times reported that the Chinese investment in overseas has decreased drastically in last year. But again, it is seeing this thing from a very narrow point of view. That BRI is all about infrastructure. It's not really in that way. So now, how that contradicts with populism idea? So when our previous panelists rightly mentioned that how the populist idea has emerged in South Asia and elsewhere in Hungary, Poland, Brazil, elsewhere has been well cited. But one of the notion that you will notice that the populism try to identify that us versus them and division within country and also within the region. But connectivity and BRI, when you mention this is quite opposite. It's not us versus them, but it's we all us together can prosper and develop our country, and which is I think very much pertinent in terms of South Asia. And if you compare South Asia as a region with our neighbor Southeast Asia, their interregional trade is 25%, where South Asia within interregional trade is 5% only, and even some cases less than 5%. Then people sometimes tend to often cite that, okay, there has been a animosity between India and Pakistan, historical, that kind of problem. But again, if you look at this kind of example in European country, for example, European Union now, we have seen there was a fierce war between European country and not quite long time ago. But now European Union emerged as one of the major trading, not only trading bloc, as of the major player in international politics. Then why South Asia cannot do so? If you look at the South Asian country, what should be their policy priorities? These countries are not struggling for their survival. Nobody is attacking each other or this sort of things. I think all of the South Asian countries, regardless of big or small, their policy priority should be economic development, whichever means possible. Because this country, if you look at from the state survival perspective, their major threat is basically the domestic violence, terrorism, and definitely the economic backwardness. But the connectivity is something that can contribute to their overall economic development and so on. But this thing we have seen quite contradictory the way the populism tendency has been rising, particularly some of this country. And now again, go to the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which is US emerged in recent time under the Trump administration. The essence of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy also that to establish rule of law, freedom of navigation, value, norms, and democracy, and so on. This, which is to say that the within country and even within the region, that country, whether small or big, it would be out of coercion, or that kind of value, principle, and human right will be protected. And country, those are sharing this kind of value, they will be organized under a common strategy to protect in the global norms and value and so on. But again, if you look at this country where we have seen the populism on rise, so that is Viktor Orban in Brazil, or we can see in Brazil, and definitely in South Asia and India, then we have seen that the question of rule of law or human rights, or even to some extent the minority has been excluded, that our previous panelists rightly alluded to. So the 2 point we can come to a conclusion here, basically, that I want to make, that as the essence of regional connectivity, which is quite necessary for not only South Asia, but the global region, for their economic development and overall prosperity, the essence is quite contradictory that the essence of populism and nationalistic sentiment. That is why we have seen that the BRI and other project is not developing as it supposed to be. And what is the consequence for that? Is those project is not working well. That's the one of the part, but I think that also run counter against the interest of the particularly South Asian country. As I mentioned earlier, that this country should not be focused on these sort of things, that us versus them and domestic identity and so on, because those may be helpful for particular political party or political elites. But basically, if you look at the country's national interest as a country, whether you can mention India, you can mention Pakistan, Bangladesh, or so on, what this country's national policy priority should be, what they should be focusing on, and then you will see these are not really aligned with this national sort of interest. And other point I will end up with by saying that the South Asian region, that even though there is 2 big country, India and Pakistan, but South Asia region is basically composed of 8 countries. And this country, I think their prosperity is co-dependent and interdependent. And if those countries work together for their regional development, whether it's connectivity and domestic development policy coordination and so on, that could be really helpful for all countries. But if one of these countries put their political elite interest or political party interest over others, and that's not really harmful, not only for their own country, also for their regional development. And this can be compared with other sub-region that which I have mentioned earlier. We can take Southeast Asia, European Union, and so on. And these countries really need to learn from how they have been able to overcome their complex history and bitterness, and really work towards their national and regional interests. So that part should be the prime focus of South Asian country, and which is quite aligned, I believe, with the BRI and FYP, and whichever development initiative is coming from developed country. They should be work in the same pace. And I will stop there and looking forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Mr. Anwar. Now, taking cue from Dr. Nilofar's presentation, where she mentioned the surgical strikes claimed by India and Pakistan, how do you, Mr. Zilur Rahman, see such practices in terms of security politics and the implications they have on populist rhetoric playing out in South Asia? The specific topic that, of course, you'll be speaking on is the role of identity politics in impacting the security dynamics and strategic stability in South Asia. Mr. Zilur Rahman, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thanks to my co-panelists. And I'm indeed enlightened to hear them. Unfortunately, I'm the only non-academic person here in this panel. And as we all know that we journalists are basically half educated. So I'm not sure that how much I can contribute here. Okay, let me start with this way, that the ideological landscape of politics in South Asia have been experiencing significant changes over the few decades. Compared to the rise of populism in Europe and the United States, as emerging trend to populist politics also being manifested in South Asia as well. Extremism in South Asia, which is questioning the cultural and religious tolerance, therefore, the current political notion is in a threat to survive. The domination of elites in political area, especially the influence of businessmen without supported by the root level politicians, have made a chaotic situations. Also, the populist leaders have blamed these elites as corrupted and disconnected from common concerns. Besides the religious extremism and corruption, South Asian countries are also being held accountable for the unstable political situation. Since the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947, the subcontinent has faced remarkable political movements, especially in Pakistan and Bangladesh, where a military constituted the government a number of times. All these concerns, beliefs, and challenges have shaped the idea of populist politics and helped it to be emerged. To be succeed in populist politics in this region, there are some challenges that need to be identified at the very first place. Unlike West, the political institutions in South Asian region are very weak and mostly traditional. Most Asian people here in South Asia are not politically educated enough that they have little concern for the rule of law, and their fragile democracy can be easily overshadowed. As remarked by Joshua Karl Lanchik, a fellow of Southeast Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, the lives of populist politics are more similar to Hungary or Poland than they are to France and Germany. On the other hand, using the populist norm, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi could manage to own the office in 2014 and is still ruling government for the second consecutive term. However, unlike India, the other South Asian region don't have stronger democratic role. Thus, we can't examine the prospect of populism in South Asia considering the situation of India. Furthermore, it has had a number of fault lines to conflict so that the inter-region cooperation is not up to the mark. The conflict of interest between India and Pakistan and India and China, the threats of terrorism in Afghanistan, all these phenomena have made it difficult for the populists to be flourished properly. Regarding Bangladesh perspective, after a great political struggle, Bangladesh finally got its independence from Pakistan in 1971 through a liberation war. The constitution of Bangladesh has encouraged both democracy and socialism at the same time, where people enjoy its religious freedom. Unfortunately, the country is not lucky enough to be stable as a nation because of several political crises. Although the concept of populism in the country is not currently working out properly, the concept of populism in the country is not currently working out properly. But if we go back to its history, we can identify the contribution of populist behind beliefs behind its political success. The turn away from 1940s Muslim nationalist politics to Bengali demands for political rights in 1960s becomes a bright example of populism acting as a tool of effective changes. For instance, the six-point program explores the demand of the mass that remains a history of populism as well. So my concluding remarks is that the political history of South Asian region is the history of populist movement. Being a region of around 2 billion people, populism has been the backbone of politics, not only in our times, but also in the times of our parents. The populist movements result in the departure of British Empire, where the issues of nationalism loses itself in populism. So we cannot deny the contribution of such political ideology in glorifying several independent movements. However, the remaining challenges need to be focused immediately if we want populism to work out effectively. Otherwise, the expected reconfiguration of a state and society would remain an illusion for us. I'll stop here.
Thank you, sir, for your insight. And with that, we will move on to our question and answer session. We've been receiving questions of a particular nature, which I will go ahead and ask to all our panelists. Now, it was interesting, the mention of European Union as perhaps the most integrated model, regional economic model in contemporary times. However, there are states like Poland, Hungary, and Austria, perhaps as well, wherein you find populist tendencies, populist notions challenging the central establishment, including of states and the European Union itself. However, knowing still the fact that there are European structural funds that are of great use and benefits to the impoverished areas in those states themselves. Now, taking reference from that, from the European region to our own region, this is a question that's asked by Mr. Umar Farooq Khan, who wants to know how can governments keep up and push back against such discourse, especially with reference to countries like Pakistan, where the government is preoccupied regularly on a daily level with firefighting. How at a state level can the state approach citizens and population at large to counter such populist notions? This is a question open to all panelists, if anyone would like to go first.
Yeah, I can go ahead if it's all right.
Please, Dr. Farhan.
Yeah, there was this news report yesterday about the special assistant to the Prime Minister on faith and religious harmony. And although he did not give us numbers, but he stated that in the past 2 months, the cases relative to false accusations of blasphemy laws, they've gone down. And again, with respect to forced conversions, again, he said that the numbers are going down because of an effective state strategy that it is pursuing. So this is what the government needs to do in terms of legislation, which can come about, specifically with respect to forced conversions, let's say, and with respect to overseeing, again, from a discursive point of view, about questions of identity, for example, which should be more wholesome, more inclusionary, and less exclusionary. What happens, and this is where the problem is, that the government is thinking more in terms of losing out on public support. It feels that it's at the electoral stage, there might be costs imposed on them if they take a particular line. But again, if larger social cohesion has to come about in society, this is exactly the kind of discourse that we need, with facts, with evidences, and of course, which tell us that there are these positives that pervade in society, and the government, in essence, is working towards that goal of bringing interfaith harmony and social cohesion within society. Thank you.
Could I just add to that?
So, please, ma'am.
So I agree entirely with Dr. Farhan's point. I think I just want to make 2 small and related points. The first is that the evidence has shown that emphasizing what's called a superordinate identity, so meaning a common identity to which all members of the nation belong, can be really effective in promoting tolerance in the sense of oneness, right? And so that common identity could in some cases be religion, in other cases it could be ethnicity, and in this case it could just be that, we're all Pakistani. Or something like that. And so emphasizing a common identity is something that the government and other actors, political actors, could certainly do as a way of saying, despite these divisions, etc. And then the second thing that I think this question that you posed with us is linked to is this idea of or question of factual veracity, right? So what are the facts that are being put forward, and how? And I think this relates to a question that has certainly been an issue here in the United States, right? With President Trump and his rhetoric, is just the amount of misinformation and disinformation, and also an issue in India that is being put forward, and the effect and impact this has on the citizenry. And I really think that this needs to be a priority among every government, and in Pakistan as well, is trying to make make clear how important it is both to prevent disinformation and also give citizens the tools to understand what is true information, right? And what is incorrect. And so whether this is digital literacy improvement or other interventions, I think this needs to be made a priority as well.
I also want to add a little bit on that, especially on the solution part, that what STEM can do. Now, this also could be seen as an example from the other country perspective. You see that our previous panelist mentioned that in US, the Trump populist rhetoric, how that affect and so on. But as at the beginning, I noticed that Mr. Rashid mentioned that how institutions work in United States, and then there is a checks and balance. Even populist leader or populist notion make President Trump as a president, but he was unable to really materialize what he wished to do because all the institution, if you look at the executive branch, judiciary and other, is not really aligned with the president as a person, his work as an institution. And the other part I want to talk about are the state building and the state or nation policy priority. That is one layer is the political party, what they want. It could be changed over the period of time, the way to achieve it through different kind of political party. But the nation objective, nation goal in the policy priority is unchanged. Now, if we look into the South Asian country, we see that our nation building, state building, or our institutional building has not been done properly. Which is why we see that when any political party come to power, whether it's populist leader or whatsoever, they were able to change the entire course of the country fundamentally. And then, therefore, we don't see that kind of national consensus that, okay, we as a nation, this is our policy priority, no matter which political party will come to power, that will be unchanged. But as according to our value of the particular political party, maybe means and way could be changed. So I think the country in South Asia can look at or to find the way to build some kind of national consensus, and also looking at the institutionalization and state building approach rather than focusing on the other minor aspect, which has been alluded by our previous panelists.
Thank you, sir. It's interesting you've brought in consensus across the region, because the next question that we have asks that does the otherization, and this is addressed to Dr. Nilofer, does the otherization of people within a state and of a population in neighboring states along ethnic and religious identities by populist leaders hold potential of convoluting or transcending into normalizing a fascist outlook and behavior towards those other groups, both inside the state and in neighboring states? How detrimental can this be for the region of South Asia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's certainly a problem. I think it's a real fear. I think once we have communalized interstate relations, what we're doing is we're equating the Pakistan-India conflict as being about Hindus and Muslims. And this is a problem because there are Muslims in India and there are Hindus in Pakistan. And I think that this is like I said, it seems like it is part of the BJP's and Hindutva's ideology in India right now. So it is not just a ramification. It seems like it is part of the intent. And we have lots of examples of the way in which Muslims are being treated in India currently. And part of the issue, like I said, is because foreign policy, voters don't vote on the basis of foreign policy. But there's no evidence in India or Pakistan that they're doing so. Foreign policy is rarely salient, right? People are often voting because of the individual who can solve their Tana Kochari problems, or because of partisan issues, or because of whatever the local electable that they consider closest to, right? So clientelism, patronage, all the things we see in other developing countries. But what happens when foreign policy becomes communalized in this way is that it does have real ramifications, right? It's not just something on a screen that we think about when an acute crisis occurs, but what we don't think about often. It becomes something that becomes part of a person's daily interaction, because if you are constantly demonizing another country, and that country becomes equated with this identity group, and that identity group lives in your neighborhood, then this is a weird conflation of what is happening, right? And so I think it's certainly very important that we move away from that in the region, because I think it can have have real ramifications of for the treatment of minorities within the region, for sure.
Thank you, Dr. Niloufar. The next question is addressed to Mr. Anwanvar from Ms. Mariam Zafar. She asks that recently India stayed out of RCEP. Economic analysts in India suggested this as a tendency of protectionism in India. If this is indeed so, what is the future of region connectivity in South Asia, given that Pakistan is driving economic connectivity through CPEC and its various projects, and how would that play out for the region?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely, and that will affect one way or another. But one of the point I want to a little bit add to the Professor Niloufar who just mentioned that India, I mean Hindu or Muslim identity in South Asia. I think it has been always there. If we look at how the country has been established, whether India, Pakistan, the religious identity has been a driving force, as we all know. And I believe this will be there for a long time. But the problem is from the leadership side, which part you want to focus on? Do you want to stick on to those kind of things? Still you want to drive in whether country is now already independent and all other countries doing their own course quite well? So we better divert our focus, that not really looking at that kind of thing, what had been done in the past, rather than looking at country-wise as a nation building, and then how we can collaborate that kind of nation building approach with as a regional connectivity or regionalism or regional development. I think that if those countries in South Asia look at their nation building strategy or national goal, that is quite aligned to the regionalism as a South Asian country. And that kind of thing, as I mentioned, as a contrast, even in Southeast Asia, which is not way much developed than South Asia in terms of per capita income and so on. But you look at their inter-regional trade in 25%. Why South Asia is only 5%? There is no other sub-region like South Asia, which you can find that the inter-regional trade is less as this. And we have SAARC, we have other organizations. Why those are not particularly working well? And one can argue that there is two big countries, they are always animosity. But then again, question would be, there is other 6 countries too. If we look from the international moral perspective, countries should not be measured based on their size and so on and so forth. If those countries we treat equally, then the 8 country, rather 6 country cannot be suffered just for the animosity or what kind of bitterness they have too. And also I think that this should be seen from a broader perspective. Even these 2 countries, India and Pakistan, have kind of hostility, but it is also in their both interest for their economic development, which is quite aligned with regional connectivity. Taking India, for example, if you look at Indian 7 sister, what is the development in there? We know their per capita income, if you see in the 7 sister, would be quite lower than many African countries. And one of the main reason is their connectivity. India cannot connect those 7 sisters with their main half of the regional development. And we see Pakistan GDP has been contributed to CPEC and other connectivity projects. Bangladesh also trying to develop some kind of connectivity. We have seen some bridge and so on. So I think this country really should focus on their national priority, which should be aligned to economic development and prosperity, and that must more rely to this regional connectivity, not really to this kind of a narrow point of view, seeing things from the particular political party, whether BJP and other, what is good for that political party, not good for the country.
Thank you, sir. The next question we have is addressed to both Dr. Niloufar and Mr. Anwanvar. The question builds upon what Dr. Niloufar said, wherein she mentioned that interstate relations, especially between Pakistan and India, are being increasingly seen through the communal angle as a relationship between Hindu and Muslim communities. And more recently, not only have we seen accentuated majoritarian narratives in domestic settings of India, but it is also feeding the security dynamics of India-Pakistan relationships, such as whenever elections come around, we see surgical strikes from India. Do we expect harsh foreign security policies from India going into the future under this current government? Please, yes, Dr. Nir.
I think the Professor Nilüfer is a better position to answer this question, but I would say that Professor Nilüfer already mentioned some part of that how this kind of populist leader try to manifest their foreign policy in regard to their domestic populism manifestation and phenomena. So that has been done various times in many countries, and India is not an exception. It will continue, but I suspect if BJP in power, this kind of identity drive in politics will be one of the driving force in Indian domestic policy, and that also will shape to the foreign policy to some extent. Even if you take the recent border clash with China, and if you see the Indian media and the way India portrayed this kind of notion that how India should respond, what is strong, which length it should go, and from IR and security perspective, we see there is also kind of diversion and variation. If India pursue a kind of threat from Pakistan, that Indian response is harsh and kind of other kind of response. But when it's come to China, we see there is kind of different kind of approach. Maybe it's largely driven by the power imbalance and so on and so forth. But the domestic dynamics, if Modi is there, I think that will shape their nature of their conducting, how they conduct their foreign policy. That is not only particularly evident in India, that will happen in elsewhere. Who is party in power, they will be able to shape or characterize their foreign policy according to their the party, incumbent party in power. But as I mentioned earlier, that the South Asian country, the nation building and institutional building is weaker, which is why the leader is able to implement what really they want to do, rather than the institutional check and balance that say, okay, judiciary and executive branch saying that, okay, you are going too far and here is the line, you have to stop. And that kind of line is thin in South Asian politics, and which is why we have seen this kind of reflection of political ideology in their foreign policy manifestation. And I think this kind of notion will continue as we move forward.
Yeah, so I agree with that. And I think Mr. Anwar's earlier point is well taken, that in a sense, this communalization of India-Pakistan relations is not necessarily a new phenomenon, right? So obviously it's been going on since independence in a large sense. I think what we've seen is a marked change in the role of the leader. So in the role of Modi, and how he has made this not only kind of like a background condition, but really much more at the forefront. And I think that this is likely to increase any underlying tendencies we saw. So while I do agree that it's a perpetuation, I think there's a marked moment where we are seeing, I think, something particularly unique in our history so far. So this is a good question, and I guess I'll answer it in a roundabout way. So one is, I think it actually opens up an avenue for much research, right? So I think one of the really interesting things that we can look at going forward as researchers is what is the impact of these acute crises like surgical strikes or something else on the inter group relations within a country, right? And so this would be interesting to see whether there is a shift in how the average Hindu in India feels about Muslims right after one of these India-Pakistan skirmishes occurs, right? And I think that if we are finding this a fact, and that I think that is there is evidence there that there is this direct link between foreign policy and intergroup tolerance within a country. And I would hypothesize that we would see this effect, unfortunately, right? And then I think that the question raises this. So there's work been done by Stephen Wilkinson and other scholars of India who look at how within India, Hindu-Muslim riots tend to break out often when elections are around the corner, right, in a way to polarize the populace. And so this has brought dividends for the BJP. So the events around in 1992 around Babri Masjid and so on were seen as an electoral ploy. And so I think that if we think of, right, so if this is again a kind of a hypothesis, but if we think of the interstate relations of Pakistan and India as kind of an extension of these communal relations. And we know that parties will polarize ethnic groups prior to elections or for electoral gain, then this becomes a really interesting question, right? Like, will there be, for the purposes of electoral gain and for an increase in hawkish sentiment, some events that take place at the state level? And perhaps, right? I mean, that seems like it would be an extension. And there are examples that we can look at that have happened. Certainly some groups are more likely to benefit, some parties are more likely to benefit from an increase in hawkish sentiment than are other groups, right? And so I think that is certainly something that we should keep an eye on. I think that's a really good question.
Thank you, Dr. Niloufar. And we'll bring in Mr. Zilur Rahman for the next question, which has been asked by Niaz Makhtoom from the University of Dhaka. And he wants to know how Bangladesh can manage their internal communal harmony when neighboring countries are fighting on religious lines. And secondly, how Bangladesh can join in the Belt and Road Initiative if some consensus does not materialize between India and China. Mr. Zilur Rahman.
Thank you for the questions. I'd like to address by this way that the economic growth of Bangladesh is remarkable over the last few years. The infrastructural development is absolutely praiseworthy, but I think the institutional development is not still up to the mark, where an ethical breakdown has taken place. We are still fighting in removing corruption in almost every area of the society. Most importantly, the mutual understanding of proper negotiation between political parties in national issues is still unseen, so the political instability is still visible. So Bangladesh is trying to balancing between China and India, and we don't know what will be the outcome in future. And let me add one thing more, that why do I think that South Asian region as a whole cannot prosper like other regions like Southeast Asia or Europe? As I said about the South Asian region have some conflicted borders between India and Pakistan, India, China, and so on. Because of the conflict of interest between Pakistan and India, the region as a whole is unable to move forward. The regional organization SAARC is not proactive like it was before. The results in lack of mutual cooperation and economic integration. So my recommendation is here that I think a mass movement is really necessary to let people aware of the real essence of populist theory. There are available social media platforms where people can share their opinion easily than ever before. So such platforms should be utilized properly. The history and role of populist politics in this region is need to be integrated institutionally. And there should be more academic work like this seminar to be held and practiced. Thank you so much. Can't hear you.
I think you're mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Zilur Rahman. And while we have you, there's another question that's been addressed to you. And we've spoken a lot about the impact of populism on security dynamics and relationship between countries. And on that regard, there is one aspect that we haven't spoken about, and that is climate security and the nexus between Bangladesh and India, which has been impacted by populist narratives. Recently, the conflict over the Teesta River between Delhi and New Dhaka has become more sharp. And how do you think the water conflict is going to be shaped in the future under the current leadership in both countries? Mr. Zilur Rahman?
Going on and on will not solve very soon, especially the water issues and the border issues. All of these are just a lip service from Indian side, and Bangladesh is just delivering what they want. That's it.
The next question we have is for Dr. Niloufar by Mr. Osama, who wants to know what can national leaders do who often invoke the narrative as antithesis or an antidote to those of populist leaders to educate people of the consequences of the reckless discourse of populist leaders.
I'm going to have to ask you to repeat that one time. I'm sorry.
No worries. So Mr. Osama would want to know what national leaders can do who often invoke their narrative as antithesis or antidote to those of populist leaders to educate people of the consequences of the reckless discourse of populist leaders?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess we could look at what's happening in the United States right now, right? So we can think of President Trump as a populist leader and President-elect Biden as a anti-pop or a non-populist leader, right? And I think a lot of what his rhetoric has been to kind of emphasize that he is a president, not of just of the red states or the Republican states, but the president, or will be the president or representative of all of the states. And perhaps because my sentiments are as it is more sympathetic to President-elect Biden, but I find that very convincing, right? And so there is something to be said about being very categorical about of acknowledging the schism in society, and all societies have schisms, right? And then acknowledging it, but saying that despite me being from this party or representative of this person, or, you know, extension being of this religious group or this ethnic group, that you are nonetheless a representative of everybody. And so I think rhetoric matters. Obviously actions matter more, but we have a lot of evidence here that part of the appeal of populists is their rhetoric. And so so rhetoric matters, narrative building matters, and very importantly, factual information and kind of trying to dampen the scourge of misinformation is going to prove really important.
Thank you, Dr. Nilofer, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the question and answer round. We do have more questions, but I believe they've already been referred to or answered to by the speakers already in their presentations, as well as the remarks in the question and answer round. I would now turn to Acting President IPRI, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, for his concluding remarks and vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Walid. Before we wind up, I think I have a question from anybody amongst the panelists could answer. The question is, what are the basic reasons that society in India has more or less accepted this populist appeal? For example, there are civil society organizations, there's media, and there's judiciary. So all of them have displayed a complete submission to populist narrative of Prime Minister Modi and his political party BJP. Even in the face of those communally charged steps that promote horizontal polarization mentioned by Dr. Farhan in his discourse, there is no resistance by the judiciary. There is no resistance by civil society, barring return of the honors, state honors by intellectuals in the past. So, do you have any, as a political scientist, do you have any particular reasons as to what are those changes happening in that society, that society is accepting that populist narrative?
Now, the question is open to all panelists. Anyone who wants to go ahead?
Yeah, I can answer this one if it's okay.
Absolutely, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the things that populists do most well than other politicians is to discredit the opposition. That's one. So whatever national elites, for example, who exist as opposition, are decried, for example, for being in power for a number of years. In the case of India with Congress, it's more than 50 years. And as a consequence, what has come down to the people in terms of social and economic necessities and needs of life. And this discrediting of the opposition, I think it provides a stronger point for the populist to make way. So I think one of the reasons why there is no opposition, or we see a lesser opposition with respect to society at large, is because the alternatives, in essence, they seem very bleak. Of course, there are pockets as well of resistance from students and other civil society actors. That is number one. Another thing related is with respect to the kind of, let's say, economic miracles, for example, which the populists tell the people that they can perform. And I think within India, they're still subscribing to the fact that Modi, for example, does not only offer a majoritarian populist alternative, but he also offers this alternative of being of refashioning the economic fortunes of India in more beneficial ways. Something that he did when he was, the chief minister of Gujarat. So I think one of the other reasons is his projection and active use of the social media and public discourse to his advantage, and the fact that is leading India towards an economic development or economic growth that is more basic than what had happened in history. I think this is another factor which makes the alternative or the opposition in India more bleak, and that is, I think, in the end, what will decide the fate of the BJP. When, for example, the economic incentives and the policies that they've, so to speak, do not deliver at the end of the day. And when that deliverance does not come down on the ground, that is where maybe the opposition can make grounds and make some cracks open within this populist discourse that presently pervades society.
Can I just add very briefly to that? I think this is a really interesting question. And I think just to add to Dr. Farhan's important points, I'll posit a hypothesis that I think is interesting, food for thought, right? And so thinking about the United States, some people argue that the President Trump phenomenon would not have happened if we hadn't had President Obama, right? And so some sense that, and this is again tying back to the politics of religion and ethnicity. And then in India, there's this argument made by scholars Ashish Nandi and T.N. Madan, and their papers, I think, were written in the 90s. And the argument was that there was this kind of imposed outside view of secularism and secularization in society, in Indian society, that resulted in a backlash that caused this increase in desire for religion to play a more central role in public sphere. So I always assign these articles in my class and always get very divided views from the students. I know these articles are people often disagree with them, but I do think it, again, kind of links back this question to these fundamental questions of religion and ethnicity and how identity lines are drawn.
Thank you, Dr. Farhan and Dr. Nilofer, for your input. I now revert back to our acting president, Brigadier Rashid Wali Zanjua. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I would once again thank all the distinguished panelists. Their discourse was very enlightening, very educative. And I think it has thrown more questions than answers. And each one of those would lead to a separate discussion in future. And we look forward to having them on our panels again to educate us. And the most important, one of the most important takeaways today was the need for a structural resilience in all societies against the populist wave. For example, Dr. Farhan mentioned in his discourse that this structural resilience in a society, that is the warp and woof of, anti-society pushback against populism. I mean, there are segments of society like academia, there's media, there's judiciary, there are civil society organizations, there are activist groups. I think if they band together and they shape up a national narrative, which is contrarian to the populist wave, therein lies the hope. And that's the only way we can reduce the vertical and horizontal polarization in a society, which complements populism. South Asia, as we have understood in this discourse, is in the grip of populist wave. How long does it continue? The hope lies in the civil society and the structural resilience of all respective societies to push back and promote the democratic, ethos. And when that happens, then all those economic and connectivity narratives would gel together in a win-win formulation for all the countries of South Asia. I once again thank all the distinguished panelists, and we hope to have them again with us in our future interactions. Thank you so much.
Indeed, sir, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
To
Thank you.
all our esteemed panelists. You're welcome, sir. This brings us to the end of today's lecture on populism and reconfiguration of state in South Asia. To the people who sent us their questions, I thank you for your active participation. Please do follow us on our official social media platforms to stay updated on all our research publications and activities. Thank you once again, and Allah Hafiz.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Chris.